Do I really need planning permission? This is the question that may well have crossed the minds of countless islanders looking to work on their homes. In this Bailiwick Podcast episode, brought to you by Style Windows, we sat down with Matthew Collins of Mac Architecture. We discussed the do's and don'ts of development, when a planning application is needed, and how to make sure your home improvement gets across the line first time around. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming in. And before we get into some of the more detailed questions, I want to get your take on development in Jersey, because despite some of the big headline pieces that we might see with major developers, what actually are islanders doing in terms of home extensions, renovations, windows, doors? What do you see as the more common examples?
Yeah, Jersey's it's quite a lucky island. Obviously, it's quite a wealthy island, and there has been, ever since I've been in business, there's been a constant desire and need from people to redevelop, extend, refurbish, modernise the houses. Some to smaller extents, others to big extents. And whilst you have the headline grabbing planning applications and things that you see in the news, there just has been a consistent growth in that kind of market for years and years, and it ranges from, as I say, small extensions to big extensions, refurbs and things like that, all from every stage of the development really, so conservatories up to huge extensions, that sort of stuff. So, and it's never really dipped off, if I'm honest. It's always been a very busy market over here.
And in terms of the planning process, because again, that's something we'll hear about quite a lot in the big news pieces, but when it comes to the everyday islander, maybe doing something, as you mentioned, on the conservatory, where does that come in? And is it something that you find people are maybe a bit apprehensive if they don't know how to navigate planning?
Yeah, I think people can be a little bit nervous about the procedures. As with every industry, I think there's a lot more, possibly more red tape and things to sign off before you start doing anything. So sometimes people are a bit confused, and they might have read something in the paper or seen something in the news that might sort of scare them even more. But generally speaking, the sort of planning process, the building control process, especially for residential properties, for small works, extensions, refurbishments, is a fairly simple process to go through. It's something you have to do, and there's timescales attached to it and costs and things which you need to be aware of. But it's a fairly simple exercise, provided you're doing something that's fairly simple and it's not too impactful on neighbours or anything like that. So.
And I suppose some people might ask, maybe out of frustration, why do I need to do this? I mean, what is the purpose in a nutshell of having the planning process?
I think people would probably prefer to be able to do whatever they want in their own homes, but obviously there needs to be control over things like that. We live in a small island where a lot of areas are quite heavily built up, etc. And whilst there's permitted development that allows people to do small extensions at ground floor and conservatories and change their house without planning permission, once you start doing bigger extensions, things at first floor that can look into neighbours' gardens or have an impact on your neighbours, or sometimes in coastal areas where they might have an impact on important views and things like that, there is an element of control that needs to be had. And that's where the planning department obviously come in. There's various roles and things that they have to do, but there is ecology, things like these sorts of subjects that are a lot more important nowadays, that on certain bigger projects, or not always bigger projects, but just on certain projects, need to be reviewed and made sure things are done the right way. And that's where the planning applications come in. They deal with all that information, assess it, and make sure that everything is, when you get your permission, that it's all done in the right way, really.
And I'm glad you mentioned permitted development, because I think it is worth diving into the differences with maybe someone's doing an extension, for example, where the cutoff is, where that becomes something major, and what permitted development actually allows for as far as the projects you've seen.
Yeah, so the planning department have a full set of regulations that you can do. It's called permitted development, so you can develop your house without having to make planning applications. It's important to say that there's the planning application and there's a building application, which are slightly separate, which we can probably explain a bit later. But in planning terms, what they look to do is, if there's items you can do to your house that aren't going to be very impactful, they can be done without any planning permission. So there are caveats to that. Obviously, anything that's listed, if you have a listed property, you need planning permission for basically anything. But if you have an unlisted property, you can replace windows, you can extend, you can do conservatories, conversions, internal layout changes. These sorts of things can all be done under permitted development. There are height requirements and size requirements, so you can do an extension, for example, to your property, but 30 square metres is the biggest you can extend, and that counts, so you can't just do one and then another and another. It sort of adds up if you did 2 15 square metre extensions. That's your permitted development done. And you can convert garages, do loft conversions and things like that, all within the realms of permitted development, as long as you're not in a listed property.
And for those who are quickly just trying to weigh up the numbers in their head, what actually would be the best way to find out if their project would qualify for either in permitted development?
Well, the planning department website actually has quite good advice. They have a section where you can look up the work you're doing. It gives you quite clear advice what you can and can't do, although I think sometimes the easiest thing is to contact an agent like ourselves, one of the architects' practices, and just get someone to come and have a look, give you some advice, and then if you're looking to do something that might be close to permitted development, they can guide you so that you can do it without having to apply. Because even if something is permitted development with the planning department, it's more than likely that you'll need to make a building application, which is a more technical aspect and is a different element, but that is something that is important to do as well. So, and they're slightly separate departments with different requirements.
Sure, and we will get into that, but touching on planning applications again, if someone, for example, has quite a large project that either they're thinking of doing or they're approaching someone like yourself to go about doing, what would be the main bits of advice in terms of navigating that process smoothly and ideally as quick as possible, I'd imagine?
Yeah, I think if it's relatively small works they're looking to do, like a conservatory or porches or something that could be made to work within permitted development, I think if they looked up the guidance in the on the state's website for that, they could follow that just to take that planning issue out of the equation. If they're doing something slightly larger or where they know they're going to have to make permissions, I think it's best to engage an agent, so one of the architects over here, just because the level of information that needs to be provided, whilst not hugely difficult if you're doing it all the time, if you've never done it before, it can be quite daunting. There's a very specific requirement of what has to go in for planning applications and maps, photos, all these things, which if you're not used to doing it, I would advise people to just get an agent, ideally.
Right. Is that something that we see people saying, oh, I'm going to give it a go myself?
Yeah, we have had various people who've kind of come in after trying to do it themselves, and I think people are more than capable of doing little drawings themselves and things, but the requirements are very particular. There has to be scale bars and certain information to get through the planning registration process has to be done in a certain way. So if you're not used to doing it, I think it can be quite painful just to get your application registered. So I'd advise people, if possible, to do things which are permitted where they don't need a planning application, but if they do need an application, it's sometimes the best route is to get an agent, an architect or planning consultant or someone like that to at least assist in that process.
I suppose potentially reducing a risk of a refusal as well, which it would be. Yes,
once you do start making an application, you're better off, I think, with engaging someone who's been there and done it before, because most of if you're dealing with domestic work, whether it's extensions and things like that, the majority of applications for something like that usually a fairly smooth process with the planning department, because we as agents and other agents are very used to what isn't usually acceptable. So it's usually quite a smooth process for a smaller project.
And going back to the other side of the coin with something like a new window or a door, again, we're talking about permitted development, I'd imagine.
Yes.
Fairly straightforward process, go somewhere like Star Windows, for example, and set it up?
Yeah, any of the reputable sort of window companies, door companies, the guys that sell conservatories and things like that, they will be very aware of all the regulations, and if they're registered with Fencer Registered, which is an association that deals with window replacements, they can come and do all of that work on your property. They don't need to get planning permission or building permission. They can actually do all of that for you if it's just changing windows and doors.
And would that be a similar scenario if it was just, increasing the size, for example, or small alterations to something they've already got?
Yes, if you're altering the size of openings, make it sort of adding glass, I suppose, whilst you don't need planning permission if you're doing that at ground floor level, because it won't really impact views of neighbours, you do need to have a building application for changes like that, because the more glass and more openings you have in a building, the it affects the sort of heat performance. So you have to have a relatively small building application done to, if you were to say take a double door and knock it out and make a bifold door slightly bigger, you'd have to do a building application for something like that.
Does that also mean that homeowners have to be careful about the materials they're choosing for, say, it's a, I don't know, conservatory roof, for example, especially with things like, you know, heat, sort of thermal retention?
Yes, I mean, luckily now everything that's sold usually is sort of all meets the current standards it has to. So it's not so much for the client to be too aware of, but luckily all the products, you know, if you get windows, things like that, all of the products that are provided now tend to meet all the standards they need to, which is good. It's only when you want to exceed the standards when you kind of have to start up-speccing on some things, which is expensive.
Well, assuming they're following that by the book, what are the main reasons that you see in terms of refusals? Again, I appreciate that that's probably the most frustrating part of a planning process, is if you do get to that stage and it gets denied. What are the most common examples of it being turned down, the reasons for that?
I think in Jersey, quite a common one is sort of overdevelopment, which is when you've got lots of people living quite close together. A lot of people over here have maximised their properties to the limit, and sometimes if you're looking to, especially if you're in built up areas and you're looking to do extensions a couple of stories high or something like that, and it can start to cause friction with neighbours, overlooking of neighbours or taking light away or anything like that. These are the sorts of things that we find can sometimes lead to a refusal. Not all the time. I think a lot of it can be managed out, but those are the sorts of things that tend to crop up for refusals at the moment. I'd say it's one of the main reasons.
And again, is that something that the homeowner can find out fairly easy beforehand, as opposed to, you know, halfway through an application? Or I appreciate every property is going to be very unique, but is that something, again, you know, seek an agent or the planning website? Yeah,
the planning department have, I think they now have, it stopped at COVID, but I think it's now back. It'd be worth checking, but I believe they have a sort of a drop-in advice section at Lamott Street, so people, if they're just looking to do a development themselves, they can drop in, and a planning officer's there to be able to give guidance for residential work. It's not really for large developments, but if someone has a query, they can go along, and I think they can have a chat with a planning officer, take some pictures and look, you know, try and show what they've looking to do, and they can get some very initial advice. And then moving on from that, if they did have an agent like ourselves or someone else, we can put some very brief sketches together and send in for what's called pre-application advice, and it's free of charge for the department. They will look at something and give you a write up on what they think about it.
And I appreciate you view the process as fairly simple, but maybe others disagree, or they're worried about the time it might take, that sort of thing. Is it, or can it be, quite a long process? Or if things are done right from the offset, it's actually not that time consuming?
It's generally for residential smaller work, it's in the region of 2 to 3 months from submission of applications to get them determined. I think there are certain bits of information that sometimes can delay it. A lot of issues nowadays, if you've got doing roof works, for example, and you might have to have ecology survey for bats and things like that, those kind of surveys can be quite time sensitive, especially if they're in areas and they think there may be bats in the area. So you might have to have surveys that can only be done in certain time frames. Things like that can be a bit of a delay to getting a determination, but generally for sort of smaller, especially residential, you're looking at sort of 2 to 3 months. And the way it's done is, if for some reason you had an application refused, they have the planning department have what's called a second chance application, where you can resubmit a new application within 6 months free of charge. So, you know, if there was an issue with your first application for some reason, you have an opportunity to send it in with some amendments that would hopefully then get it passed the second time.
That's probably quite a unique one to crop up there. Any other examples of perhaps maybe not your everyday scenario for an application in terms of environmental impact, I guess, for the bats there?
Well, that's one. It's ecology generally. I think if you're in some of the national park areas, so like St Wands Bay and other areas like that, we're talking to the sort of most sensitive areas in the island. The planning applications are sort of, it's the highest standards expected in areas like that. So there is ecology being quite an important one. You know, there might be various things you have to look at in St Wands Bay. You have to deal with lizards and other elements like that. It's quite a specialist field, if I'm honest, which we don't deal with, but we have associates that will come in and do that for us. But that can make things slightly more complicated, especially if you're in the coastal areas. impact on sort of views from bays below and things like that, or if you're above a listed harbour, say Roselle or somewhere, you might not have a listed property, but if you're close enough to the harbour, the same as St Albans, where you've got these sort of listed areas, they can have a slight impact on your planning applications.
So definitely want to add to the list. Homeowners keep in mind where they are actually can affect the application.
Yeah, in those areas, the sort of coastal national park areas, definitely they're just the most highly protected in the island. So but it doesn't preclude you from doing stuff. It just means you probably have the level of information required and the sort of level of finish you're supposed to put forward, and level of design has to be of the highest standards really in those areas.
But in terms of the restrictions generally, do you think they're fairly tight? I mean, if we take out listed buildings, as we mentioned at the start, and then, as you just said, the areas that maybe overlook a bay or a site of interest, is it fairly sort of strict in your view?
No, I don't think so. I think the permitted development for most housing is pretty spot on, actually. It lets you do small bits that you wouldn't want to have to apply for, so just little extensions off the back of the house or something to get a bedroom, or things like, or extend your kitchen and things like. Most of that, it gives you the ability to do that without having to go to planning. I mean, as I say, there are caveats, and people would have to read there's boundary restrictions, and you can't be within a metre of boundaries and things, but generally I think they give you the flexibility to develop your house to a certain level. I think they're adequate.
Sure, but in terms of the appeals process, I appreciate that is something I'm sure you've had to help islanders navigate. You mentioned the second chance application. Just walk me through what the first steps would be if they do get it back and it says refused.
Well, yeah, there's various ways you can do that. You can reapply and do you'll get a report that says why your planning application is refused, and the first option is to take those refusal comments and change your design or change your scheme, send back in another application, and hopefully that would get you your permission. However, obviously a lot of people are quite precious about what they want, or they may disagree. So the first avenue you have to push the decision is you can put it in front of the planning committee for what they call a review. And that is, you get to the planning officer who refused your application will present it to the planning committee. It's usually held once a month, which is made up of a collection of politicians, and they will view the application, and you get an opportunity to speak and just defend why you'd like to do what you're doing. And they essentially vote, and if you get enough yeses, they will overturn the decision the planning department have made. And that I've found quite a useful tool especially for smaller residential things. If it's just a small technicality and there's a bit of it's a 50-50 decision, the committee can be quite favourable. It's different when it gets to much bigger projects, as you're probably aware. It becomes a bit more political, but for smaller residential things, the committee can be quite useful because they're looking at it from a sort of whilst they have to follow the island plan policies and things, they seem to obviously take a sort of common sense approach as well. So it gives you a layer of review, and if that was to not go your way, you can do what's called a third party appeal, which is a slightly more serious review of it, which goes to the GREF, which isn't a very common thing. I don't find for smaller developments. Normally the planning department and yourself would just come to some kind of an agreement on something like that, but it's more for bigger schemes, as you'll have seen in the news. They have an inspector from the UK, etc.
So again, coming back to, or I suppose away from the big headline projects, in terms of going to the committee, not something to be apprehensive of. If we kind of mentioned our earlier point about people being a little bit fearful of the planning process, maybe some are saying, well, it'll probably get refused, I won't bother. Again, if they have that option and maybe like you say, it does get overturned and goes through the committee, not something to be scared of.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, it should be mentioned that the committee, it's not only if you want to argue your application or request a review. If your application goes in and you have, I think, 5 objections from neighbours or something like that, then even if the planning department support what you're looking to do, it will have to be signed off by the committee anyway. So it may be that your application's gone in, the planning department say this is fine, but 5 neighbours have objected, separate neighbours. You have to then have that signed off by the committee, so you might end up having to go there as part of the process anyway.
And we did say that we would touch on it later, so building control and the difference there, it's worth getting into how that stacks up against, permitted development and the planning process in general.
Yeah, this is a bit, I think, that can confuse people a little bit. So planning department, or planning permitted development allows you to build a 30 square metre extension, for example, on your house. However, building control will only allow you to build something of about 20 square metres. So there's a bit of a difference there, and there are different requirements. So building control is very much about checking that what you're building it's using the right insulations, it meets all the right thermal values, it's structurally safe, it's got enough ventilation, all the sort of building regulations that you need to meet. So their requirements are probably a bit stricter. So if you wish to change windows, as long as you use what they call a fencer registered supplier, like a Style Windows or someone like that, that can be done without any permissions. But if you were replacing wooden windows or something like that where you don't have a registered installer, you'd have to apply to building control. Conservatories, you can put small conservatories on without building permission, but they can only be 20 square metres, and they have to have doors that separate, like external quality doors to separate them from the house, and you can do very small porches and things like that. But once you start doing any fundamental sort of changes to your house, if you're moving your kitchen or knocking walls around, you almost certainly have to have a building application. So even if you may not need planning approval, you would need a building application. That's why I was saying it's always worth maybe running your scheme past an agent, because there's the two avenues you have to go down, and one you may not need to, but the other almost certainly would, I'd say.
Well, you mentioned that it's a little bit stricter, and I appreciate you said that the planning application process in general you feel is adequate. When it comes to the regulations, are there any that maybe stand out to you as being at least ones to watch? Maybe not too harsh, but they've cropped up time and time again. With building control, I think sort of fire regulations, things like that, obviously there's some big safety issues there. So there's little caveats if you do build a little conservatory outside your house. There are ones like that are quite important. Staircases, things like that, there's quite strict regulations on them, and I believe it's because obviously of years of experience, they're quite areas of danger. So if they're not done properly and properly assessed, that there's damage that can be done. And also, when we're trying to be sustainable as possible, you want to ensure that buildings are being done thermally, properly insulated, and you're doing it in the right way. And that's what the building regulations do enforce, is that all this is done in the right way. So any extension with building control, you have to have an energy survey now, which is quite important. So you get an energy survey of your house, so you know how it performs. Then you've got to contribute a small sort of improvement to your house as part of doing an extension and things like that, which I think ultimately are very good things moving forward. Sure, but do they stack up in terms of cost? Because I was going to ask earlier, we mentioned, pre-planning advice. I know you said, you can get that as a free service sometimes, but maybe the application itself or where it goes from there. Is it a costly process?
The building control process, or all of it, planning end, but it can be costly. I think if you're just talking about applications for small extensions that just fall into the planning remit, etc., I don't think you're talking excessive fees. You've got planning is all charged basically on the square meterage of what you're actually asking for. So it's relatively small fees, and building control have set bands for fees. So I couldn't confirm them exactly, but if you're doing an extension to your house, it's sort of high £100 application fees rather than thousands and thousands. So there are costs, but I don't think they're excessive in line with when you compare them to building costs, and also the amount they can add value to your property as well. I think it's all relative over here.
And we talked at the beginning about the demand in Jersey. I think you said, it is a lucky island. A lot of people looking for this kind of work to be done on their homes. As far as companies go, is there a fair degree of choice either, in from the UK or Jersey? You mentioned Style Windows, for example. Yeah,
Jersey's lucky to have quite a big array of builders of all types and suppliers. I think a lot of people have a sort of an initial reaction of trying to go off island to save money, I think, if I'm being honest. But I think Jersey's quite unique. It's supplies are not the easiest because we're coming to an island, things like that, and also having companies that are over here that can oversee the work or come back after they've done things. I think people underestimate how important it is if you have your windows fitted by someone and someone comes over from the UK, it's great, but if they'll never come back to 6 months later if you need adjustments or anything like that. And I think there's quite a lot of importance to be weighted on using local contractors. I think Jersey is a unique market, and the local builders and contractors are set up perfectly for it. So, and we have got some great builders of all sizes over here. So
Do you think that's in part because they have maybe a better understanding of how the planning process, for example, works in the island, as opposed to, if you contract someone from the UK to come in, maybe they do things a bit differently over on the mainland?
Yeah, I think so, because I don't know the regulations in the UK, but I think for smaller things, there's sort of less regulation when it comes to the building control side, I believe. So whereas over here, obviously, even the smaller projects, your building officer will come at the end, inspect and do things like that. So I just think it's not just that, it's sort of it's having the relationships with the local suppliers and everything to get things on time, and I think there's a lot of importance on that. Whereas off-island contractors, I mean, there are some that come over obviously on bigger projects, etc. But when you're looking at sort of smaller residential, I think the best way is to stick with local contractors, and there's various ones, so you can get a good array for tendering and different prices, and there's lots of good guys over here for that sort of work.
So final point to yourself, whether it's something under permitted development or windows, doors, a bigger project, final point to make to an islander who's thinking about it, but maybe the planning process is giving them a little bit of apprehension.
Yeah, I think if they're unsure whether they need to do anything with the planning department or anything, they can either go to the drop-in advice or phone up the planning department, who are quite useful, will be able to just give advice, or contact some of the agents, whether it's us or any of the other agents out there, who can and just explain what it is you're looking to do. I mean, we'll come and see anyone, have a look at what they're looking to do. We can then guide them through the process, whether they choose to go with us to do that or go somewhere else. And I think most of the local, if you're looking for windows or other things like that, most of the companies over here also know the regulations and can advise as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for your time.
That's okay. Thank you very much.